I can see people now.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Tony. Are we audible? Are we audible to you?
No, I can't hear anything. I've turned on the captions, so I'm just reading the closed captions.
Can you hear us?
Hello. Hi, Tony. Can you hear us now? Hello? No.
I cannot hear anything.
Okay, we will just WhatsApp you a message and then see how can we get over this technical issue in a minute.
You can hear me okay? Yes, I see it. I see it thumbs up. So if the worst comes to the worst, we could possibly proceed, and I can communicate via the chat function if needed.
You can text him.
Okay, I can start if that's okay. I'll just share my screen if it works. Of course, it's always the way with technology. It was working okay yesterday.
Can you hear us now? Mr. Tony? Are we audible? 1, 2, 3, check.
Okay, can you now see my screen? Can't. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Harendra. Okay, good. Thank you. Apologies for the slight technical issues there, but I hope you can all hear me around the room okay. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope the conference is going well. And I am calling to you from a very cold Canada right now, and early in the morning. I'd imagine it's a little bit warmer where you are, but I am very happy to join you, and we're going to maybe try some more technical exercises here. But I just wanted to give you an overview of the session of what I propose to cover, which is an overview of the anti-doping landscape. I am currently working in the education department at WADA. I take care of the social science research and the policy side of things in the education department, and that will become a bit clearer as I talk through some of these areas. But I'm happy to take any questions specifically about any of those items as we go through. But maybe just to make sure, because it's one of the challenges about presenting online is I don't get to see the reactions of or engage with people in the same way to see what people are more interested in, because I would definitely want to be focused and maybe emphasize more or dwell a little longer on things that people are a bit more interested in. So I presume people have their phones available, and maybe this is a bit risky given that we're having some technical issues. But just seeing if this is possible, if you can use the QR code on the screen using your camera. And I have set up a little poll where you can rank the topics that I just proposed to cover in what you're most interested in. So the World Anti-Doping Program is around the code, the structure, and all of the anti-doping stakeholders and WADA's role within that. The education programs in anti-doping is about education policy, the international standard for education, and what that might look like in India. Evidence-based education is around the research and how that is informed within education programs. And then research is looking at some specifically of what WADA does to promote research in those areas. So I can see some people are already answering, which is great. Thank you. I'll give that another 10 or 15 seconds. Give me a chance to drink some more tea for this hour of the morning. It helps. Okay, I see we're getting some more. I'm just checking online just to see if there's people still engaging, and just else and continue on then. Okay, so I will spend a little bit more time on the research and on the evidence side of things. So I guess we may have more of an academic audience in relation to this today. So that's fine. So I will go ahead with that, and thank you for your engagement. There will be another little engagement at the end with using Slido. So this is where I am in Canada right now. I'm in the north of Montreal. I'm actually back in Montreal City itself. This is where WADA is based. And I think it's a little bit different maybe than your climate. This is actually what it looks like during the summer. And this is actually what it looks like right now for me. It is minus 30 degrees centigrade over the weekend, which was quite an interesting thing. I'm not from Canada, I'm from Ireland. So I'm more used to rain and wet and wind. So when I take my dogs for a walk in the morning, it does sting a lot. So it does take a long time to warm up. I think it is a little bit different for you. So looking at where we want to go and what we're looking at here is to start. I'll assume that people have some knowledge around anti-doping, but I will just give an overview of the structures and where WADA fits in the anti-doping landscape. And what that starts with is the World Anti-Doping Code and the International Convention Against Doping in Sport. The code came into force in 2004, and I'll talk maybe a bit more about the background and the why to that a little bit later. But at this point, we have almost 700 signatories to the code between national anti-doping organizations, international federations, major event organizations. And that, of course, means that when you sign up and become a signatory, you are mandated to follow you are mandated to follow all the requirements, all of the necessary protocols and procedures within the code. When that came in, it was clear that there was a need also to bring the governments into play, and they were not able to be bound by a non-governmental document. So UNESCO developed a convention against doping in sport. And as of now, more recent, I think we're up to 192 maybe state parties, maybe 193. But that is almost all governments have signed up to be party to the UNESCO convention. That's 98% global endorsement. And when you think about all of the sports and everything like that, almost the whole world is covered by either the code or the convention. What that looks like then is that within the code, it goes through all of the different requirements around testing, therapeutic use exemptions, what is on the prohibited list, testing and investigations, compliance with the code, what's that supposed to look like. So underneath all of that is then international standards, which are larger documents, which get into the very nitty-gritty of all of these different areas. I am responsible for the one on the left, is the international standard for education, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. But all of these different areas are all very, I guess, esoteric within their different disciplines. Like, for example, the international standard for laboratories that the laboratory in New Delhi would have to follow and make sure that all of their testing and all of their procedures are in line with that. WADA's job then is to ensure that people are aligned with that and they're following that, the code and the international standards for that. Underneath that, we also have a role in providing guidelines and providing support. Anti-doping is getting a lot more complex every time. We're currently in the fourth iteration of the code, and we'll be going into the fifth one in 2027. All of the new code and international standards were just approved in Korea last month, and every time there is things added. So it gets more difficult for people to kind of stay abreast of all of the changes across all of the areas, and that's definitely one of the challenges that we have. And these are the partners then that we are involved in. As you can see on the top left, we have the public authorities and the sport movement. You'll see there that the 50% donor from the governments and the IOC, that is the funding model that we have for WADA. When it was established, the IOC said that they would fund WADA and match the funding for any money that the governments give. So the Indian government makes a contribution to WADA. That then is matched by the IOC. We currently have a budget of just over $50 million US, and that may seem like a lot of money, but in terms of turnover, it is well below that of, you can imagine, one Premier League club, or even here in North America, and there's many athletes that make more than that in a year. So relatively speaking, it's not that much to coordinate a global movement with all sports organizations and all of the structures and all of the requirements that are involved. Over here on the right, I just highlighted academia and research as one of the partners that we are involved in. We do engage with academia in a number of different ways, but this is something that we're looking to get more involved in. Academia is probably one of the more underutilized partners that we have, given that the level of expertise and the level of levers that are available in terms of funding that can be accessed in each country. So that's definitely something that we want to look at. So then, how do we start thinking about how does all this get coordinated into changing athletes' behaviors, or how does it interact with athletes' lives? So to start with, we have a lot of athletes under the code. In the last code compliance process, we asked our stakeholders how many athletes are under their jurisdiction. When we added that up, it was 100 million athletes. And altogether, they're the ones that are under the jurisdiction. Most of those are recreational athletes. About 75 million recreational athletes are subject to either testing or subject to the rules of the code. About 25 million national level athletes, they're the ones competing in each country at a national level. And then there's about 1.5 million international level athletes that are the ones I guess most people think of when we're thinking about anti-doping. They're the ones that we see on the TV. They're the ones that are more likely to be tested. And of course, they're the ones who are more likely to be sanctioned at the end of the day. When we also added up the number of athletes that got educated, and this is something that definitely raised their eyebrows. You can see most athletes are uneducated. They're the blue portion of the athletes there. So when you think about what athletes are subject to in terms of having to pee in front of a stranger if they're getting tested, if you also think about the consequences of testing positive, we think that the most important thing is that athletes are at least aware of the rules that they're subject to. And this is something that we need to really address, and something that through the International Standard for Education that we're trying to build infrastructure that any athlete who is subject to the rules of the code can at least access information and ideally be educated in a more formal way or in a more interactive way. So looking at how this gets implemented in the structure, because there's obviously a lot of complications around how does the laboratories and testing interact with education and the prohibited list and all of the different elements and structures of anti-doping. So the structure is built around, the outside is the rule of law. In a number of countries, there is legislation around doping. So that is the legal framework that is embedded at a national level. You can see around in the gray area there, it is also around the compliance framework. So when we have rules and regulations, it is important that there is a regulatory framework put in place for that. And what we've tried to do is maybe more focus the system towards what our mission is. What his mission is to work towards a doping-free sport environment. And what we're trying to do is focus more on prevention. The early part of anti-doping was focused on trying to catch cheats and take them out of the sport. That's still very much the part, but research has shown us that you can't really test your way out of this problem. There has to be more of a prevention focus, more of an engagement with the athletes, around the athletes, the coaches, their parents. So there is a structure that's needed for that. And now that focus is towards clean sports. So the top of the pyramid here is what all of the other different areas of anti-doping are moving towards, is making sure that athletes and the elements of the anti-doping system are operating in tandem with each other. That starts at the bottom. So education is seen as targeting all athletes. So the 100 million athletes that I mentioned, education programs are structured and set up to try and get as many of those as possible. And I'll talk a bit more about education program and what that entails in a couple of minutes. And after that then is what all of the rules act as a deterrent effect. Now, ideally, athletes would not be interested in doping out of choice and because it aligns with their values, which is, of course, what we aim to do. However, there are also, it is important to make sure that there is a deterrent effect, that athletes are aware of the rules for that. So once they're aware of the rules, it's kind of like having a speed limit. Is a lot of people will speed in their cars, but they won't speed if there is a speed limit. So there is that element to how we implement that. So detection, that's mostly what people think of in anti-doping is the testing and the investigation side of things. So at the minute we test globally about 300,000 tests per year, about 100,000 athletes. Again, quite a small number in relation to the overall athlete population. And then enforcement, that if an athlete does test positive or does return an adverse analytical finding, is that there is a legal framework there to enforce that. So that's called the results management process, and athletes are sanctioned through that. So as athletes progress through that, their experience of that should be that first they're educated and they're aware of the rules, so they know that they should be deterred from taking any substances. They know that they should not be reckless in taking things that they shouldn't be taking. And they should be aware of certain behaviors that they have to do if a doping control officer approaches them. They know that if they are tested, that their sample will be sent to an accredited laboratory. They should know then that if there is a positive test, that there is a legal framework in place to make sure that the right decision is arrived at for that. So that is the prevention model within which we look at. So this, I'm not going to obviously go into the detail of all of this. This is more for illustration purposes. This is then all of the different organizations in one country. This is an Australian example of all of the different interactions between all of the different organizations and how they interact with each other. And this starts at the top level with WADA, the IOC, the international bodies, and UNESCO. And it then comes down to the national level. And of course, you can transpose the Indian context onto this or any country, because we have done this in a couple of other countries and it does stay the same. And then as you go down through the structures of the national level, you see, for example, the National Olympic Committee, the government association like the NADO, the National Anti-Doping Organization. Then you get into the professional clubs, the research groups, and then you start getting into the athlete environment, the coaches, the educators and everything like that. And then you start getting into where the athletes are. And so what you can see is that WADA, for example, is very much removed from the athlete. We are usually about 7 layers apart. So our interaction with the athletes is very limited. Our stakeholders are mainly at a higher level. So our goal is to try and make sure that the rules and regulations, that the practices are going downstream effectively. And then when you start putting in all of the different anti-doping protocols in here, like the education programs, testing programs, who's doing what, setting up whistleblowing programs, where does research come in to things, how does WADA then interact with the different organizations at each of these levels? It becomes a very complex situation. So as you can see, this becomes quite difficult then to coordinate. And we're going to probably look at doing this in a lot more countries to kind of see what the structures are. But you don't have to do to this level. And this is called the STAMP model. And the reference there is with Scott McLean that did this in 2023. And it's important to realize is that from our perspective, we would multiply this by almost 200, this situation here. And again, it kind of amplifies the complexity of the system. And that's before you even look at the structure of an international federation, like the International Cricket Council or something like that. So we are dealing with quite a complex issue there. So then the question of setting all of this up, this has taken 20 years for all of these structures, all of these rules and regulations to be put in place. And especially when there's scandals and everything like that, people kind of will ask, well, why are we doing this? Why is anti-doping in place? And I think that's a question that needs to be always asked because if at the minute, WADA has a budget of $50 million, globally on anti-doping, we probably spend between 850 million and $1 billion on that. So again, it's a small percentage of the sport industry, which depending on which literature you read is between 600 to $800 billion. So a small percentage of that. But it is a massive inconvenience on athletes, on stakeholders to set up all of the anti-doping structures. And at that point, people say, well, you know, why bother have anti-doping? So I think it's always important to remember why it actually was established in the first place. And when you think about, I'm not going to go back, say, to when the anti-doping started, the first testing started coming place in the 1960s, but when it started to really become on the radar was in the 1980s with the Ben Johnson scandal. And then there was the East German scandals with the athletes being dosed systematically. And then this is the catalyst that all of that led up to with the establishment of WADA, with the Festina affair, the Tour de France in 1998, which led to WADA being established in 1999. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of all of the scandals. Like, I mean, you can see all the way through from the last 20 years that we have had a number of things that do challenge the system all of the time. So when you see all of these, and then if people are going to cheat anyway, then if we're saying rather why anti-doping, why bother set up all of this system at all? Yeah, if I was in person, I'd maybe have a bit more of an interaction with you about this question because it is an important question. But we have looked at this, and I think it is important to say when anti-doping wasn't in place, and when it came to 1998, the world did say we have had enough. Sport is important. Sport has value to society. Almost every society in the world stood up in 1999 at the World Conference in Copenhagen and said, sport is worth protecting. And sport has value. And when you think about the world today and all the conflict and everything that's there, the idea that the whole world said together in unison, sport is important to all of us. And why that is very different across the world. But it is important for people that no matter what country, no matter what culture, no matter what level that you're playing at, is that everyone finds some kind of joy, or there's some essence of sport that is different. And that has come up a lot as well in the literature, where people have said, well, sport is something that is based on Victorian values, that it is too paternalistic. Is who are we to tell athletes what they can and cannot take? And that this is just coming from someone that has said that there is a moral purity to anti-doping that we don't need. So as a proud Irishman, I get very strange feeling when I'm told that the reason I love sports so much is because some English gentleman in the mid-19th century decided what sport values are, and this is what they are. But I don't think that is the case. I think when we saw the scandals in all leading up to the 1990s, is that the world said sport is different and it is worth protecting. And when we did see things like athletes being doped at systematic level, we do say no. And it is something that everyone wants to be a part of. And that's not just all of the values and all of the joy and the fun at the lower levels or when you're young. That is all the way through, is that people want to see, the sport that they're watching at a high level. So for me, for example, if Ireland are playing India in the Cricket World Cup, and by some miracle we do win at some point, it would be important for me that win is clean, that it's not tainted in any way. I don't want it to be followed or to hear of a scandal at a later point. So it is coming at some point. Maybe not anytime soon, but at some point, I'm sure Ireland will give India a good cricket match at some point. Okay, so the education programs, moving into more specifically, so you see at a global level, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot going on. If you think about an athlete getting tested, the coordination that is required to go and test that athlete at any point to then get that sample, whether it's urine or blood, to travel halfway across the world in some cases, to have it analyzed in a certain way, and to have those results managed in a uniform fashion is quite complex. Educating people about all of those things is also quite a challenge, and that's where we come in. And what I'll do with this section is just go through the requirements of education right now. So the requirements of education that will come into place next year, these are mostly in place right now for the 2021 code, is that we're not telling people how you can educate athletes. How someone gets educated in China is very different from how someone gets educated in the USA. But what we do standardize is the structures around your education program. So what is required is that you have to have an education plan, you have to implement that plan, and then you have to evaluate that plan. And that is where we come up with the pie analogy. So apologies in advance, I'm going to beat this analogy to death over the course of the next few slides and explore maybe what this can look like individually in different countries. So I'd maybe ask you is that as I'm going through this, is that you maybe engage with it in a way that you're thinking about it from an Indian perspective or wherever you're coming from today. So the first thing is that in the plan, then you're required to have certain types of ingredients that go into that. So everyone has to analyze their sports system. Everyone has maybe a similar type of athlete pathway, whether it's a sport or at a national level. Most systems have a pathway where the athletes are playing recreationally or for fun at lower levels, at school level. Then there is usually some type of structure when you get into the high school level. And then there is a competitive structure at the national level before going international. So understanding what and that experience is for the athletes, understanding the infrastructure for each country, like I just showed for the Australian example, is important to be able to analyze and go into the education plan. Then in that plan, there are two main groups that are mandated to be educated. That is athletes and athlete support personnel. Within those groups, then there are mandatory categories that are also mandatory to be educated. So any minor that is competing internationally, and this is new coming in next year, has to be tested because we have seen situations where children have been, their first experience with anti-doping has been with a foreign doping control officer. So you can imagine how traumatic that would be if you're a 14-year-old girl or boy, and a stranger comes up to you and says that they need you to pee in a bottle, and that stranger is going to watch you do it. That's quite a jarring experience for that. So we require at least to be in the education pool, which is a group of athletes that the National Anti-Doping Organization targets and develops a program to target them. So any athlete as well that's in a testing pool has to be included in the education pool. The athlete support personnel of any of the athletes should be included in the education pool as well. Any athletes that test positive for doping have to be included, and any athletes that are subject to any of the rules should be included in that education pool too. So then to implement, the educators are required to deliver education programs. What's been added now this time is that more of a structure is that educators have to be recruited, trained, accredited, and then there has to be some type of reaccreditation program that focuses on their competencies about how they deliver education. Acknowledging prior learning is also something that came from the athlete population. Athletes were getting a little bit tired of having to do the same education over and over again. So that can happen when if you're, say, a track and field athlete and you get educated from possibly the athletics integrity unit, and then you can get educated from your NADO, then you can be required to be educated before the Olympic Games. So in some instances, some athletes were being asked to do the same e-learning program a number of times. So what we try and do is that if an athlete has been educated by someone else, is that then that education is accepted possibly as a means of entry into a games. But then what that should do is then allow the resources to be focused on other athletes who are not educated. What we're trying to focus as well is that we noticed that athletes going to and competing in games are the focus for a number of different organizations. So what we're trying to do is that before athletes get to a games is that they have some type of pre-event education. We also recognize that at the games, athletes should have an opportunity to engage with someone who's qualified or able to provide information to them. And this can happen at national and international events as well. One of the things with education is that it's probably the only area in anti-doping that you're required to assess how effective your program is. And this is something that maybe isn't done as well, or not done, I guess, intuitively or instinctively in education programs. So what we require is that any education that is delivered, you record the number of learners that are gone through. Where there is face-to-face learning is that you maintain the records of those athletes, and then you do an assessment. Assessment, of course, can take different types of forms, whether it's from the satisfaction of people that engaged, their confidence to go through the things that they were educated on. So, for example, do they feel comfortable taking supplements based on the education that they were given, or applying for a therapeutic use exemption? Then the anti-doping organization has to collate all of that into an evaluation report. And what we want people to do is to start thinking about the impact that their program is having. So are the attitudes of athletes changing? Are the prevalence of doping going down in any way? And then we have, of course, as I said, all of the different areas around all of the different organizations. So national anti-doping organizations, international federations, major event organizations, national Olympic committees. All of these are all interacting in the same space. So what we have done is try to make clear who does what in this system, because there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And what we have done is now specified other types of roles and responsibilities for other types of federations and people in the system. So like national federations, governments, regional anti-doping organizations, and WADA itself. And all of that comes down to is that this is the things that people are required to do. So you have to have written down 4 key documents: an education program, a curriculum document, an annual education plan, and then an evaluation report. That is what WADA then assesses every year or when we go through the code compliance process. And that is what we determine whether someone is compliant or not with an education program. So looking ahead, where we get to is that we're definitely progressing. We have seen progress between the last 2 versions of the code. People are more aware of what they're supposed to do, but we now have an established education community. It is very much collaborative, and we do have a broader reach, but we still have a long way to go. And we are very ambitious about this. So then, like when you put all of this together and you think about the ingredients of what that is that people think about, well, what does this mean for me? Is that all of the interactions of all of this, an education program has 4 key elements. It has to have awareness raising, it has to have information provision, it has to have anti-doping education, which is training people about all of the different rules and regulations. And that should be underpinned by values and be informed and infused with values education throughout. So the idea is that we're not dictating what the education program is or how it should be delivered, is that everyone has their own specific pie that they want. I won't try and pronounce this, but this is when I looked and I spoke with Professor Chaware Utsaf, he told me that this is a traditional Indian pie. So every country can have their own type of pie. We're not telling that everyone has to have the same, is that everyone can develop their own and make sure that it is appropriate for their own context. And that brings me to the evidence side of things and where that comes from. And when we think about doping behavior, we think about all of the different interacting effects of that. When we started doing the research program, there was a perception that doping is a very simple behavior, is that people just cheated because they wanted to win. And they would do anything to win, and that's as simple as that. They would think of maybe Lance Armstrong or any other high-profile cases, is that dopers are bad, clean athletes are good. But when we looked into it, we started to see all of the different interacting effects that go into a decision to dope, or sometimes it's not even a decision, it's an accident. And it's very, very complex to unpick and then build programs around that. So these interacting between the personality of the athlete, the personal situation, the environment, and also the social situation. A lot of times these can interact in a way to make someone more vulnerable to doping in different ways. Because we have still yet to see anyone that when they go into sport with the intention of doping, or that they would be willing to dope, something happens in their environment that changes that. And they may be more likely to, or maybe more susceptible to begin with, but there is definitely something happening in the environment. And that's what we try to understand, is doping is now classified as a wicked problem, meaning that there is no specific solution, there's no magic bullet, and there's a number of different factors that go into a doping issue. So then when we look at what is for effective education from the research side of things, at our level, what we try and look at is more the meta studies of what goes into that, rather than all of the different primary studies, because what we're trying to do is look at consensus for this. So the first one we looked at, we commissioned, was back in 2012. And they looked at all of the literature around what is effective education. So the first number of things that came in is that education should be targeted at a young age as much as possible. It should be tailored for the population, so that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that kind of what I was alluding to in the previous section about at a national level, that it should be tailored. But for every single population, every single education situation, the education material should be tailored, and the interaction and experience should also be tailored. Interactive and active participation. And this is something where it's come back from the athletes, is that they don't need to be just told the same thing over and over again. They need to be able to be active and participate in the session. So if you're telling someone about how the testing works, it is better to go through a role-playing situation for that, is seen as more effective. We also see that it's important to not just focus on transferring knowledge, is that it's important to focus on behavior and training people how to behave in the way that you want them to behave. A very important one on the education side is well-trained educators. For some reason in anti-doping, it's seen as almost acceptable that anyone can do education without being trained, whereas no one says that someone can adjudicate on a case if you're not a lawyer, or if you can handle a therapeutic use exemption application if you're not in some way medically trained. So the same applies for education, is that people should be trained. Multimodal, in that the athletes should be getting the messages, not just from an anti-doping organization, but from their coach, from their parent, from their national federation. That's and from, most importantly as well, from their teammates or their peers. That's where the message really starts to sink in. And then it's not just enough to do one education session. It is important that we do a number of different booster sessions, that they're reminded of their education afterwards. So all of that requires a lot of structure, a lot of planning, a lot of coordination in order to put this in place. And just to come back to this, is that this is what we used to put into the requirements of defining what education is for anti-doping. All of these different dimensions around awareness, information, anti-doping education, and values-based education. More recently, last year, there was a systematic review around how effective education was. And we started seeing the similarities come true again, is that education is most effective when it is multifaceted. That is, it's not just focused on one thing. So knowledge, yes, but also focusing on skills again, promoting healthy and fair play behaviors. And so not just saying no. Traditionally in anti-doping, we have focused on telling people what not to do. Whereas if you're telling people what not to do, inadvertently you're telling them that you need to do something. But if we're not telling them what that is or articulating what that is, that's a limitation of the program. So that means that we want them, if you're taking supplements, that you're checking the label, that you're speaking to a nutritionist. If you're going to take a medication, that you're aware and that you're able to do a therapeutic use exemption application or tell someone necessary that they can, who will do that. Include support personnel in the intervention. This was something where we obviously try and educate coaches and parents as well. But there's also nothing wrong with including the coaches in the same education. We've seen that work quite well, where the coaches sit in with the athletes on that. Including assessment and evaluation is very important. And because that actually factors in as part of the intervention when athletes reflect on what they have done. And then focusing more on risky athletes. And this is kind of what people think about when they think about doping, is those athletes that are more susceptible to doping in some ways. And one of the challenges about educating for anti-doping is that most athletes don't intend to dope to begin with. Most athletes align to the values of anti-doping. And where risky athletes are identified, and there's another literature on that, but there are athletes who do become more vulnerable to doping. And what the literature shows is that it's important to bring in different types of interventions, like bring morality into it, psychological or cognitive and educational interventions, so that you're making sure that there's different types of messages coming through to the athletes. And blended learning is also coming through as well. E-learning as well as face-to-face. What we want to see is that people are able to take advantage of face-to-face situations, interact and engage with the athletes, whereas knowledge and focus would be a focus of the e-learning programs. And then the other meta study that was done last year was from Mexico, that looked at all of the different elements and all of the different interventions. And again, we're seeing the same patterns around what is effective education. So again, the mix of focusing on knowledge and values, active collaboration, multiple sessions, so it's not just one-off education, and then importance of the message coming from people around the athletes, and reinforcing those messages over time. So that all comes together to kind of show that we do now know what is effective education and how to deliver that. Putting that in place is the challenge for sure. So now when we're looking at what is the evidence and how we're trying to gather to see how effective that is and put in place the structure. So there's different things that people would be looking at and what we would be interested in trying to look at a global level. Utsav set me on some things that people are interested in the Indian context around the different psychosocial constructs that people are interested in, such as looking at athlete populations. How do athletes view the moral stance towards doping? This is very typical, as you'll see, when we ask athletes, do they think anti-doping or doping is morally wrong in some circumstances? And overwhelmingly, what we see is about 80% of athletes say doping is morally wrong under any circumstances. But we do then see that some of them will say it's okay in some circumstances. Or we have usually about 5% will say that it's okay. And they're the ones that maybe most people think about. And education programs should really be ensuring that 80% that don't intend to dope are educated in a way that they're equipped to know what to take, what they shouldn't take, and how they should behave. But the idea as well of doing surveys at a national level is also that you can see if it can guide and make your education program more sophisticated. Because if you see on the NATO 5 over here, they can see that they're below the norms in terms of their athlete population and how they view doping. So that can then inform maybe a focus of the education program to maybe look at more of the values side of things. And as I said, there's different types of constructs that you can look at where measurements are validated to be able to guide education programs and to see the profile of the athlete populations. So when we asked how much considerations would you give to offer to athletes who are offered a prohibited substance, again, we can see across the different NATOs that most would not give any consideration. But as you look at NATO 4 and 5, you get to see that there is an elevated one of some that will give a little consideration. So there's an elevated number of athletes who are maybe a little bit more susceptible to doping. So again, that informs the education program. And it also, if you're collecting data around what types of athletes, if there's an age-specific category that are more vulnerable, if there's different types of sport that are more vulnerable, then again, you're able to tailor your education program more effectively. So what we're trying to do is put in place a structure that will spread funding around the globe to be able to look at some of these questions, put in place some surveillance, examine the effectiveness of education, all different elements of research. When we set up the social science research funding in 2005, we have a grant program. We reassessed this in 2020 and we realized that a lot of the funding was going to Europe. They had, for different reasons, very strong structures in being able to apply for grant programs. In the last 4 or 5 years, we have looked at to rebalance this. So you can even see now we have a lot more projects in Asia coming through, in Africa, so that we can get more of a sense of what is happening globally when it comes to this, because it's not just a case of determining what is effective education in one country and then transposing that to another. It is important that we examine all contexts as much as possible. And in terms of the knowledge that we have seen, we see very much a dominance of psychology in the research that's been done so far. So this is also something that we are looking to rebalance as much as possible. So in the first 15 years, you can see that almost half of all projects that were funded had some type of psychological intervention in that. So what we're trying to look at now is trying to spread that across a bit more. So looking at getting things like education researchers involved, sociologists, legal experts, epidemiologists. These are the types of things that we need to, in order to get a more rounded view of what is the nature of the problem and how are we going to solve those problems. We're also trying to get away from people working in silos, where we're looking at either multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary teams, so that we get, again, a more full-rounded and 360-degree look at and insights into how we can be more effective in delivering education programs or anti-doping programs overall. So when we look at what we're interested in researching, we start initially with the athlete. We're interested in what are the impacts that are influencing the athlete, and we work out from there. We say, what are the influences, the athlete support personnel? What are education programs that are effective? How do we make them better? And then within the World Anti-Doping Program, all of the different elements of that, how can we pull levers and examine how we can understand how all of that works better? And then as we move out ecologically out to the wider areas, is that what's happening in the sport environment that that can all the way influence the athletes. So we know that if certain types of sport policy can make athletes more vulnerable. If you're expecting athletes to ride around the bike around the country for 3 weeks, we know that that puts physiological pressure on athletes, that it can increase vulnerability. So making sports more aware of policy decisions that they make and the impact that that has. And of course, all the way at the societal level, knowing that different countries have different cultures and different influences and different attitudes and different behaviors when it comes towards sport, different postures towards that. And all the time, what we're trying to do is understand how that transcends down and influences athlete behaviors and attitudes. So looking towards what we try and do to support this, we have a grant program, and we encourage as many people, particularly from academia, to apply for this as possible. We have about $500,000 per year available to the grant program, and we have different tiers of programs available. Usually from tier one are the international projects, from about 75,000 to 150,000. And we see these as being multi-sport, multidisciplinary, and the same tier two. These are smaller projects, but can happen in one country across multiple sports, or in one sport across multiple countries. And tier three projects, smaller projects where we try to support early career researchers, but also things like pilot projects, in order to then build an evidence base that we would then support bigger programs at a later point. I realize I'm running low on time. I don't want to go over time. So I can happy to circulate this after, but if you're interested in applying for the WADA grant program, the main message coming from our reviewers is that less is more when it comes to just articulating what is the problem that you're interested in looking at, that making sure that that's aligned with the research question. The literature should be focused, and then the research design and methods should all align with trying to answer the research question, and being able to articulate the significance and dissemination of that. We do have a number of resources online available and videos, that if you're interested in applying to the WADA grant program, there is an ability to access those resources, videos, and everything like that. So I will leave it at that, and maybe just have another poll while I will hand it back to Utsaf or whoever's in the room, if there's any questions or comments or interventions for that. And so I'm trying to practice what I preach. I know engagement is limited given the format that we have. And there will be another question after this that I will leave open for that. I would appreciate any feedback that you have. We will be expanding this presentation for some of our stakeholders, so that we will be evolving this presentation. So if you have any feedback about what works well or what doesn't work well, some of the messages, that would be much appreciated. So I know this is a challenge in that I can't hear you, but
Are we now audible to you?
sorry.
Are we now audible?
So I will hand it over.
As
Now,
we have
I just want to say thank you for your attention. I know I could see as I was speaking, people were a little bit uncomfortable on the screen as they were going around, so it was interesting to see that. But again, I'm happy to.
As we have technical issues, we won't be taking question answer sessions now. And with that, I would now request Dr. Gaurav Kushwaha, Associate University Dean and Director School of NCC, to kindly come on stage to virtually felicitate Mr. Tony. Thank you, sir. I now request Ms. Anupama to start with further proceedings.
Good evening, everyone. As we gather here for the